would come off the airplane, the bomb would come out like this and then go. And of course, the airplane was at 70,000 feet, so there wasn't an escape problem up there.
In 1960, a US Navy aircraft climbed higher than 17 miles above Earth, reaching an altitude where the sky turns dark and the air is too thin for normal engines to breathe. At that height, commercial airliners today would instantly stall, and even most fighter jets cannot survive for more than seconds. What makes this even harder to believe is that this aircraft was not a space vehicle, not an experimental rocket plane, and not launched from the ground vertically. It took off from a normal runway, carried a 1,000 kilogram payload, and was designed to operate from aircraft carriers at sea.
As a young aviator, we were flying low altitude and high speed, and after a few hundred hours, you got too comfortable at doing that.
The pilots briefly experienced weightlessness, their engines flamed out, and the jet rolled over near the edge of space before falling back to Earth. The record they set crushed the previous world mark by more than 24,000 feet, a gap so large it shocked aviation experts at the time. This achievement stood unchallenged for over a decade and came from an aircraft many people today have never even heard of. Keep watching as we uncover how the North American A3J-1 Vigilante pulled off one of the most extreme altitude records in aviation history. On a cold December day in 1960, something extraordinary unfolded over the clear skies above Edwards Air Force Base in California. Far from an everyday military flight, one of the US Navy's newest jets was about to push the boundaries of what anyone thought was possible for a carrier-capable aircraft. That jet was the North American A3J-1 Vigilante, a sleek radar-teched bomber designed in the late 1950s to deliver speed and power from the sea. On December 13th, 1960, with Commander Leroy A. Heath in the front seat and Lieutenant Henry L. Larry Monroe in the back, the Vigilante roared off the runway and set a record that would be talked about for years in aviation circles. At the end of that flight, it stood at 91,450.8 feet above the ground, higher than anything else in its class had ever gone, while carrying a substantial payload of 1,000 kilograms. In doing so, this big Navy jet shattered the existing world altitude record by more than 24,000 feet and held that record for more than 13 years. The story of the Vigilante's record begins with the aircraft itself. North American Aviation, the same company behind the famous P-51 Mustang and the F-86 Sabre, was commissioned to build a powerful carrier-borne jet bomber for the Navy in the early 1950s. The Navy wanted something fast, something modern, and something that could deliver a nuclear weapon from the deck of an aircraft carrier deep into enemy territory. The result was the A3J-1 Vigilante, later redesignated as the A5A when the US Department of Defense aligned aircraft naming systems in 1962. Initially intended for nuclear delivery missions, the Vigilante was impressively advanced for its time. It was powered by two General Electric J79G E8 afterburning turbojet engines, each capable of producing up to 17,000 pounds of thrust with afterburners lit. With those engines, the aircraft could accelerate past Mach 2, which is more than twice the speed of sound, and cruise at speeds over 1,300 miles per hour. When the Navy began testing the Vigilante's performance, pilots and engineers quickly discovered that the aircraft had raw power well beyond the original design's expectations. For a bomber built for long-range missions from carriers, it climbed steeply, it flew fast, and it handled well enough that it looked more like a fighter than a conventional bomber. Its internal bomb bay was set up as a linear bomb bay, which was a novel design that slid weapons out the back of the aircraft at high speed. Although that bay caused technical quirks and never saw a live weapon drop in combat, it contributed to the Vigilante's streamlined shape, which helped it make the altitude record attempt. In the context of the Cold War, setting aviation records was more than just bragging rights. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a competition to prove technological superiority in all domains, including air power. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, FAI, the international body that ratifies aviation records, kept a close eye on attempts to break altitude and speed records. At that time, the existing absolute altitude record for a jet aircraft carrying a 1,000 kilogram payload was held by a Soviet Yakovlev Yak 25RV that reached 67,096 feet in 1959. The US Navy wanted to beat that number decisively and show what American engineering and pilots could do. Commander Heath and Lieutenant Monroe were selected for the task. Heath was an experienced Navy test pilot with a background in high-performance aircraft, and Monroe was a skilled bombardier navigator whose job was to manage navigation, systems and instruments throughout the flight. On the morning of December 13th, they climbed into the Vigilante's pressure-sealed cockpit, sealed their suits, and prepared for a mission that was part test flight, part scientific experiment, and part historic attempt. Once their engines were fired and they were lined up on the runway, there was no turning back from a feat that involved both mortal risk and national prestige. Takeoff was routine enough for a jet designed to operate from aircraft carriers, though even getting this large aircraft into the air required precise handling. Once airborne, Heath pushed the throttles forward and leaped into open sky, building speed and line-straight acceleration that would eventually carry the aircraft to Mach 2.1. At more than twice the speed of sound, the Vigilante was in territory where only a handful of jets could follow. As the speed climbed, the ground below disappeared at a dizzying rate, and soon the pair were heading sky-high at a pace that would make military pilots a few years earlier swoon with excitement. Once at the target speed, Heath gently nudged the jet's nose upward. Instead of holding a steady climb angle, he pushed the Vigilante into a near-vertical ascent. This wasn't a typical climb used in everyday flight or combat, but a zoom climb. In a zoom climb, a pilot trades horizontal speed for vertical height. The faster you are entering the climb, the higher you can take the aircraft before it runs out of airspeed and lift. For the Vigilante, this meant pitching up sharply and watching the ground fall away while the powerful engines continued to push them through thinner and thinner layers of atmosphere. As they blazed into thinner air, the aircraft began to slow down. At around 91,450 feet, where the atmosphere is so thin that normal wings lose their ability to generate lift, the Vigilante finally ran out of forward speed. The instruments showed airspeed dropping to about 400 miles per hour. At that point, the engines themselves began to flame out because there was not enough oxygen for combustion. This made the aircraft effectively unpowered for a moment. Without thrust or usable airflow over the wings, the Vigilante was briefly weightless, like a spacecraft coasting in microgravity. Heath and Monroe recalled feeling that sudden loss of weight as a brief but surprising sensation. Chiefly, they reported it as a pleasant sensation, a unique experience that no normal flight provides. The aircraft's nose pitched back slightly, and it began to arc over, rolling onto its back as it lost aerodynamic control. This sounds alarming, but the crew knew from previous test flights that it could happen. Heath released his hold on the controls, and the Vigilante simply followed a natural arc downward. As it descended into thicker air, the engines relit on their own, and control returned to normal. The physics of this maneuver put a big emphasis on preparation, experience, and confidence in the aircraft's design. What looked in theory like a risky loop through the edge of space had been honed in practice to a calculated envelope that the Vigilante could survive with the right handling. When the flight data was checked later, it confirmed that the US Navy had accomplished what it set out to do. The altitude of 91,450.8 feet easily surpassed the previous world record of 67,096 feet, set by the Soviet jet over a year earlier. The difference was more than 4 miles, or over 24,337 feet higher than the prior record. The attempt was officially recognized by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, and the record stood for more than 13 years before being exceeded again in the 1970s. This was no ordinary accomplishment for a bomber-type aircraft, and it sent clear signals about American high-speed aviation capabilities. For Heath and Monroe, the achievement didn't go unnoticed. Secretary of the Navy, William B. Franke, awarded Heath the Distinguished Flying Cross, and Monroe the Air Medal for their roles in the record-setting flight. These medals are given for heroism or extraordinary achievement in aerial flight, and it was a fitting recognition for what they had done. The flight became part of naval and aviation history, talked about in pilot lounges and engineering meetings alike for years to come. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more aviation history. Drop a comment with the next topic you want covered, and we'll see you in the next one.